You've already come out in support of this national holiday. Why is that, and what did the government do to consult with the AFN on this initiative?
This is an important, the stat holiday, when it comes to residential schools. Our Assembly First Nations, even going back to 2010, our chiefs in Assembly have passed resolutions calling for this statutory holiday. And it's very important because I've always talked about the need to educate the Canadian people about the impacts of the residential schools. So education awareness should lead to understanding, should lead to action. So it's a very important day.
So if we have a stat day off for this, does it do any good if there's not an educational component along with it? It just could be another day off.
Well, that's the whole thing. You know, we have so many statutory holidays in Canada already, but this one to me is different. This one to me is very important. This one to me is a chance to educate all Canadians about the impacts of the residential school and the impacts that we still see in 2018 and beyond, the intergenerational trauma, the intergenerational impacts of the residential schools. Like, I don't call it cultural genocide. I call it genocide of a people. And it was really trying to kill First Nations people in Canada. And when I say that, I think about their languages, our culture, our individual self, our families. So when you have a statutory holiday, it is a chance to educate Canadian people about those impacts. And this is a very important thing to have. And I would urge all the Canadians to really use that day to learn about the residential schools. And I'd even go one step further and call on all provincial premiers and governments to change their curriculums as well and teach this in the school systems, right from kindergarten to grade 12. That's all part of that education awareness campaign.
So the day is a result of one of the calls of action from the TRC Commission. How satisfied are you that the federal government is on track to enact the 76 that fall under their jurisdiction?
Well, again, we were pleased as chiefs in Assembly when the Prime Minister came and he mentioned 5 things to our chiefs a few years back. 1, that there'd be an inquiry into missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. 2, that all 94 calls to action will be implemented and honored. 3, there'd be investments in education. 4, a new fiscal relationship with the Crown. And 5, a federal law and policy review. Those things were stated to our chiefs in Assembly. Now, when it comes to the 94 calls to action, there's still a lot of work to get done. You're not going to implement those 94 calls to action in 1 or 2 fiscal years. There has to be long-term sustained strategies. And so there's got to be a greater emphasis, a greater focus, greater amount of resources, both human and financial, to get it done. And that's the push that we have to keep doing from the Assembly of First Nations, is pushing for those resources to make sure that it happens sooner than later.
And beyond having a national holiday, what else would you like to see Canadians doing to mark this tragic period in history?
Well, again, I would say when you start talking about, there's 2 things that hurt First Nations people in Canada. 1 was the residential schools, and it was a genocide of our people. Number 2 was the Indian Act in 1876. So I would urge all Canadians, when the federal government starts looking at law and policy review, when they start looking at an act to revitalize Indigenous languages, when they make investments in education and housing and water, to support those things, because the gap in the quality of life will start to close. And I say to Canadians that that's not only good for our people, that's good for Canada, because there's a high social cost and a high monetary cost to maintaining the status quo. So when the federal budget announces billions for housing and water, that's a good thing. When the federal government announces there's going to be greater investments in post-secondary, that's a good thing, and we need Canadian people to say that. When the federal government says we're going to enact an Indigenous languages bill, that's a good thing. And so get behind those things. And that's what I'd urge all Canadians to do, because it makes things easier when all of Canada can work in the same direction, building a better country together. I've always said that we've got to learn from the past, not live there, and let's chart a better country for all of our children and grandchildren, those yet unborn. And we can only do that by working together.
Do you have a preference of what day this is, whether it be September 30th, June 21st, Indigenous Day, or Orange Shirt Day? Do you have a preference?
No, I don't have a particular, as National Chief, I don't have a particular preference for what day. You know, I'd take it back to our AFN executive, back to our chiefs in Assembly. We want to be involved in picking the day, no question. And I think when we bring our minds and heads and hearts together, we'll find the right day so that it has really meaningful impact, not only for First Nations people, but for all Canadian people right across Canada.
Thank you so much for joining us to talk about this, National Chief Bellegarde.
Thanks for the opportunity.